Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places. What happens when raw aggression meets unwavering discipline? When modern rebellion crashes headlong into centuries of tradition? This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a leather-clad biker who thought he could intimidate anyone, and Sergeant William Hayes, a Royal Guard who proved that true strength isn't about the size of your motorcycle or the volume of your voice. On a busy Tuesday morning in London, these two men's paths crossed in a way that would change both their lives forever. What started as a moment of road rage quickly escalated into something much deeper. A clash between two different worlds, two different codes of honor, and two very different definitions of what it means to be strong. This isn't just another story about instant karma. It's about the moment when someone who thought they were untouchable discovered what real power looks like. It's about respect, dignity, and the surprising places where life's most important lessons can be found. And most importantly, it's about how sometimes getting knocked down, both literally and figuratively, is exactly what someone needs to finally stand up and become the person they were meant to be. The events that unfolded that day would be captured on dozens of smartphones, shared millions of times across social media, and spark conversations about respect and responsibility that would last for months. But behind the viral video and the headlines lies a much deeper story, one that reveals how a single moment of poor judgment can lead to the most unexpected transformation. Marcus Thompson revved the engine of his Harley-Davidson one more time as he sat in the morning traffic outside Buckingham Palace. The chrome pipes gleamed in the early sunlight, and the thunderous rumble of the 1,200 cubic centimeters engine turned heads all along the crowded street. At 32 years old, Marcus had spent the better part of a decade cultivating his image as someone you didn't want to mess with. Standing 6 feet tall, with arms covered in intricate tattoos and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months, he looked every bit the part of the rebel without a cause. The morning had already started poorly for Marcus. His alarm had failed to go off, making him late for an important meeting with potential clients for his motorcycle repair business. Then, his girlfriend Sarah had called to inform him she was moving out of their shared apartment, claiming she was tired of his anger and unpredictable behavior. The final straw had been the parking ticket he'd discovered on his bike when he left his flat in South London, apparently placed there sometime during the night for parking in a resident-only zone. As he waited in the stop-in-go traffic, Marcus felt his frustration building. The tourists walking along the sidewalks moved at what seemed like a snail's pace, constantly stopping to take photos and blocking the already congested streets. Street vendors called out their wares, adding to the cacophony of car horns, bus engines, and general city noise. The smell of exhaust fumes mixed with the aroma of food trucks created a thick, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on everything. Marcus checked his watch again and realized he was now running nearly 45 minutes late. His potential clients had specifically requested an early morning meeting, and he knew that showing up this late would likely cost him the contract. His business had been struggling for months, with larger chain stores undercutting his prices and online retailers making it easier for customers to get parts delivered directly to their homes. This contract could have been a lifeline he desperately needed. The traffic light ahead turned green, but the cars barely moved forward. Marcus could see that some sort of ceremony was taking place near the palace gates, with crowds of people gathered behind barriers and what appeared to be a changing of the guard in progress. The street was partially blocked off, forcing all traffic into a single lane that moved at an agonizingly slow pace. Marcus gunned his engine in frustration, the loud exhaust note echoing off the buildings around him. Several pedestrians turned to look, some with annoyed expressions, others with curiosity. He didn't care. The world seemed determined to make his day as difficult as possible, and his patience was running dangerously thin. In the distance, he could see a line of tourists queuing to get closer to the palace gates, their cameras and phones held high as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the guards in their traditional red tunics and tall black hats. The sight only added to his irritation. These people had nothing better to do than stand around taking pictures while people like him were trying to get to work and make a living. As Marcus sat there fuming, his phone buzzed with another text message. He pulled it out and saw it was from his potential client, asking where he was and mentioning that they had another appointment in 30 minutes. Marcus typed back a quick response explaining about the traffic, but he could already sense the disappointment in their reply. This was exactly the kind of unprofessionalism that had been hurting his business. The traffic inched forward another few feet, and Marcus found himself directly parallel to one of the palace guard positions. He glanced over and saw a young man in the iconic uniform standing perfectly still at attention. The guard couldn't have been more than 25 years old, with a clean-shaven face and the kind of military bearing that suggested years of disciplined training. Something about the guard's perfect posture and unwavering focus irritated Marcus even further. Here was someone who probably made less money in a month than Marcus spent on motorcycle parts, yet he stood there like he owned the world. The guard represented everything that Marcus had come to resent about authority and traditional institutions. In his mind, these ceremonial positions were nothing more than tourist attractions, fancy dress-up games for people who had never faced real challenges in life. Marcus revved his engine again, this time directing the noise toward the guard. The sound was deliberately aggressive, designed to be disruptive and intimidating. Several tourists turned to stare, and Marcus could see security personnel beginning to take notice. But the guard didn't even flinch. He continued to stare straight ahead as if nothing had happened. This lack of reaction only made Marcus angrier. He was used to people responding to his presence, either with fear or at least acknowledgement. The fact that this young soldier could simply ignore him felt like a personal insult. Marcus had spent years building a reputation as someone who commanded respect through intimidation, and having that power dismissed so easily was infuriating. The traffic moved forward slightly, and Marcus found himself even closer to the guard position. He could now see the details of the uniform, the perfectly polished boots, and the ceremonial sword that hung at the guard's side. Everything about the scene represented the kind of rigid formality and tradition that Marcus had always rebelled against. Without really thinking about the consequences, Marcus decided to make a statement. He swung his leg over the bike and dismounted, leaving the engine running as he walked toward the guard. His heavy boots echoed on the pavement, and he could feel the eyes of dozens of tourists and bystanders following his movement. As he approached, Marcus could see that the guard was even younger than he had initially thought. There was something almost innocent about his face, despite the serious expression and military bearing. This only reinforced Marcus's belief that he was dealing with someone who had lived a sheltered life, protected by tradition and ceremony from the harsh realities that people like Marcus faced every day. The guard's name was William Hayes, though Marcus had no way of knowing this at the time. William was indeed 24 years old, but his apparent youth was deceiving. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood in Liverpool, the son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their family afloat. He had joined the army at 18, not out of some romantic notion of military glory, but because it offered him a chance to escape a cycle of poverty and provide for his younger sister's education. William had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for the prestigious position of Queen's Guard. The selection process was incredibly competitive, requiring not only physical fitness and military excellence, but also the kind of mental discipline that allowed someone to stand motionless for hours while crowds of people tried every possible method to get a reaction. As Marcus approached, William could sense the tension in the air. His training had taught him to be aware of potential threats while maintaining his ceremonial duties. He had dealt with disruptive tourists before, people who tried to touch his uniform or get him to break character. But there was something different about this approaching figure, something more aggressive and potentially dangerous. Marcus stopped directly in front of William, close enough that their faces were only a few feet apart. The contrast between them was striking. Marcus with his wild hair and leather jacket covered in patches and studs, and William in his immaculate red tunic with its bright brass buttons and perfect military creases. The crowd of tourists began to take notice, with many pulling out their phones to record what they sensed might become an interesting confrontation. Some moved closer to get a better view, while others stepped back, uncertain about what might happen next. The atmosphere grew thick with anticipation. Marcus stared directly into William's eyes, trying to provoke some kind of reaction. He had expected to see fear or at least uncertainty, but instead found himself looking into calm, steady eyes that showed no emotion whatsoever. This only added to his frustration and sense of being disrespected. The moment that would change both their lives was now just seconds away, though neither man fully understood what was about to unfold. Marcus was operating on pure emotion, driven by a combination of anger, frustration, and wounded pride. William was following his training, maintaining his discipline despite the obvious provocation. What happened next would be captured on dozens of camera phones, and shared across social media platforms around the world. But more importantly, it would set in motion a series of events that would force both men to confront fundamental questions about strength, respect, and what it truly means to be a man in the modern world. The collision of two very different worlds was about to begin, and neither Marcus nor William would ever be quite the same again. Marcus felt the heat rising in his face as he continued to stare at the motionless guard. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Around them, the crowd of tourists had grown larger, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen. The clicking of camera phones and the murmur of excited voices created a background soundtrack to the tension that was building between the two men. William Hayes maintained his position exactly as his training dictated. His eyes remained fixed on a point in the distance, not making direct contact with Marcus, but still peripherally aware of every movement. His breathing was controlled and steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through his system. Years of military discipline had taught him that the best response to provocation was often no response at all. But Marcus interpreted this lack of reaction as disrespect, even contempt. In his world, when someone got in your face, you either backed down or you stepped up. This silent treatment felt like the worst kind of insult, as if he wasn't even worth acknowledging. His hands began to clench into fists, and he could feel the familiar surge of anger that had gotten him into trouble so many times before. The tourists continued to gather, many of them assuming this was part of some kind of performance or ceremony. Some were asking each other in hushed tones whether this was normal, while others were already posting live videos to their social media accounts. The hashtag Buckingham Palace drama would start trending within the hour, though neither Marcus nor William knew that at the time. Marcus took a step closer, bringing himself within arm's reach of the guard. He could smell the starch in William's uniform and see the perfect military creases that spoke of hours of careful preparation. Every detail of the guard's appearance was flawless, from his polished boots to the precise angle of his hat. This level of perfection only added to Marcus's resentment, representing everything he saw as fake and pretentious about traditional authority. In his mind, Marcus began to construct a narrative about this young soldier. He imagined him coming from a wealthy family, probably attending private schools before joining the military for a bit of adventure and prestige. He saw someone who had never faced real hardship, never had to struggle to pay rent or worry about where his next meal was coming from. The guard's composure seemed like arrogance to Marcus, a sign that he thought he was better than everyone else. The reality, of course, was very different. William Hayes had grown up in council housing in Liverpool, raised by a mother who cleaned office buildings at night and worked in a factory during the day. His father had left when William was 8 years old, leaving the family with nothing but debts and broken promises. William had learned discipline not from military school, but from necessity, taking care of his younger sister Emma while his mother worked, making sure she had clean clothes for school and help with her homework. The army had been William's escape route from a life that seemed to offer few opportunities. He had excelled in basic training, discovering that he had a natural talent for the kind of mental toughness that military service required. His selection for the Queen's Guard had been the culmination of years of hard work and dedication, not a privilege handed to him by circumstance. As Marcus continued to stare at him, William found himself thinking about his sister Emma, who was now in her second year at university studying medicine. The money from his military service was helping to pay her tuition and living expenses, making it possible for her to pursue dreams that would have been impossible for their family just a few years earlier. This thought helped him maintain his composure, reminding him why his duty was important and why he couldn't allow himself to be provoked. But Marcus knew none of this. All he saw was someone who seemed to think he was too good to acknowledge a regular working person. The longer the silence continued, the more his anger built. He had come here already frustrated from his morning of setbacks, and now this kid in a fancy uniform was treating him like he didn't exist. Marcus began to speak, his voice low but clearly audible to those standing nearby. He started with mild complaints about the traffic and the inconvenience caused by the ceremony, but his words gradually became more personal and aggressive. He questioned whether the guard thought he was better than everyone else, whether he enjoyed making regular people's lives more difficult with these ridiculous displays. William continued to maintain his silence, though he was acutely aware of every word being spoken. His training had prepared him for verbal harassment, teaching him that the best response was usually no response. Engaging with disruptive individuals typically only escalated situations and could lead to more serious problems. The crowd was growing larger and more animated. Some tourists were encouraging Marcus, thinking this was entertaining street theater. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing that the situation was becoming genuinely hostile. A few were beginning to look around for security personnel or police officers, though none were immediately visible. Marcus's monologue continued, becoming increasingly personal and insulting. He began to question the guards' courage, suggesting that anyone could stand around in a fancy costume, but it took real bravery to face the challenges of everyday life. He talked about his own struggles, his business problems, and his frustration with a system that seemed to favor people born into privilege. As his speech continued, Marcus began to pace back and forth in front of William, his movements becoming more agitated. His voice grew louder, and he began to use profanity that made some of the nearby families uncomfortable. Several parents began to usher their children away from the scene, though many continued to film with their phones. William could feel the situation escalating, but he remained committed to his training. He knew that palace security would eventually intervene if the situation became truly dangerous, and his job was simply to maintain his position until that happened. The ceremony that was taking place nearby was still ongoing, and breaking character would disrupt an important tradition that brought joy to thousands of visitors every day. Marcus interpreted the guards' continued silence as the ultimate insult. In his mind, he had laid out his grievances, explained his frustrations, and essentially demanded respect as a fellow human being. The fact that this soldier continued to ignore him felt like a complete dismissal of his worth as a person. Without really thinking about the consequences, Marcus reached out and placed his hand on William's chest, giving him a light push while demanding a response. The touch was brief and not particularly forceful, more of a gesture to get attention than an actual attack. But it represented a line that should not have been crossed. William felt the push, but maintained his position, though his training now categorized this as a potential security threat. Physical contact with a Queen's Guard was a serious offense, and he knew that the situation had moved beyond simple harassment into potentially criminal behavior. Marcus, frustrated by the lack of reaction to his push, decided to escalate further. He placed both hands on William's chest and shoved him much harder, putting his full weight behind the action and clearly intending to knock the guard off balance. The push was forceful enough to make William stumble backward several steps. His military training kicked in automatically, and he spread his stance to maintain his balance while quickly assessing the level of threat he was facing. The ceremonial sword at his side remained untouched, as protocol dictated that such weapons were only to be used in extreme circumstances. The crowd gasped audibly as they witnessed the confrontation escalate to physical contact. Many continued to film, though some were now calling for security or police intervention. The atmosphere had shifted from curious entertainment to genuine concern about what might happen next. Marcus felt a momentary surge of satisfaction at finally getting a visible reaction from the guard. The stumble had been clear evidence that his actions had an impact, breaking through the wall of indifference that had been so frustrating. But that satisfaction was short-lived, as he quickly realized that he had crossed a line that might have serious consequences. William steadied himself and immediately returned to his formal position, though he was now on high alert. His training had taught him to expect that physical confrontation might continue to escalate, and he prepared himself mentally for whatever might come next. Despite the aggressive behavior he had just experienced, his discipline held, and he did not retaliate or abandon his post. The incident had now been recorded by dozens of smartphones and would soon be uploaded to various social media platforms. The confrontation between a leather-clad biker and a royal guard would quickly go viral, generating millions of views and thousands of comments from people around the world. But for Marcus, the immediate consequence was a growing realization that he might have made a serious mistake. The initial rush of satisfaction from getting a reaction was being replaced by an understanding that assaulting a Queen's Guard was probably a criminal offense with potentially severe penalties. The stage was now set for what would happen next, and neither man had any idea how dramatically their lives were about to change. The seconds immediately following Marcus's aggressive push felt suspended in time. The crowd of tourists stood frozen, phones still recording, uncertain whether they were witnessing street theater or a genuine assault. William Hayes had regained his composure and returned to his ceremonial position, but there was now a subtle tension in his stance that suggested readiness for whatever might come next. Marcus found himself in an unexpected moment of clarity. The adrenaline that had been driving his actions began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of what he had just done. He looked around at the dozens of people filming him, at the concerned faces in the crowd, and at the young soldier who had somehow managed to maintain his dignity despite being physically attacked. For the first time that morning, Marcus truly looked at William Hayes, not as a symbol of authority or tradition that he resented, but as an individual human being. The guard was younger than Marcus had initially realized, probably not much older than Marcus's own younger brother back in Manchester. There was something in the soldier's bearing that spoke not of arrogance or privilege, but of genuine discipline and commitment to duty. William, meanwhile, was following protocol while also making rapid assessments about the situation. His training had taught him to remain alert for continued threats, while also evaluating whether the immediate danger had passed. The man who had pushed him was now standing several feet away, no longer making aggressive movements. But William knew that situations like this could escalate again without warning. The crowd began to stir as people started to realize that what they were witnessing was real conflict, not entertainment. Several tourists moved their children further away from the scene, while others continued to film, recognizing that they might be capturing something that would become significant news. The murmur of voices grew louder as people began to discuss what they had just seen. Marcus felt a wave of shame beginning to wash over him. The anger that had seemed so justified just moments before now felt petty and misplaced. He looked at his motorcycle, still running in the street, and realized that he had abandoned it to confront someone who had done absolutely nothing to deserve his aggression. The guard had simply been doing his job, standing at his post as thousands of soldiers had done before him. As he stood there processing these thoughts, Marcus became aware of movement in his peripheral vision. Palace security personnel were approaching from multiple directions, their professional movements indicating that they had been monitoring the situation and were now responding to what they correctly identified as an assault on a Queen's Guard. The lead security officer was a woman in her 40s named Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, who had worked palace security for over 15 years. She had seen countless incidents involving disruptive tourists and protesters, but physical assault on a guard was relatively rare and always taken very seriously. As she approached, she was already mentally preparing the paperwork that would be required and considering the various charges that might apply. Detective Inspector Collins addressed Marcus in a calm but authoritative voice, identifying herself and asking him to step away from the guard position. Her tone was professional, but left no room for negotiation. Behind her, two uniformed officers moved into position, ready to intervene if Marcus showed any sign of continued aggression. Marcus complied immediately, raising his hands to show that he wasn't carrying any weapons and backing away from William's position. The fight had gone out of him completely, replaced by a growing understanding of the seriousness of his situation. As a business owner with no serious criminal record, he knew that an arrest for assaulting a royal guard could have devastating consequences for his future. Detective Inspector Collins began asking Marcus basic questions about his identity and the events that had just occurred. She was required to investigate any incident involving physical contact with palace security or ceremonial guards, and her questions were designed to establish the facts while also giving Marcus an opportunity to explain his actions. As Marcus provided his name and address, he found himself struggling to articulate why he had acted as he had. The frustrations that had seemed so overwhelming just minutes before now sounded trivial when spoken aloud to a police officer. Traffic delays, business problems, and relationship issues were challenges that millions of people faced every day without resorting to physical aggression against strangers. William remained at his post throughout this interaction, though protocol allowed him to provide a statement to investigators when his shift ended. He had dealt with various forms of harassment during his time as a Queen's Guard, but this was the first time someone had actually pushed him. Despite the violation he had experienced, he found himself feeling somewhat sorry for the man who was now being questioned by police. The crowd of tourists continued to watch the unfolding drama, though many were now beginning to disperse as the immediate excitement faded. The videos they had recorded would soon be uploaded to social media platforms, where they would be viewed millions of times and generate thousands of comments from people around the world sharing their opinions about the incident. Detective Inspector Collins explained to Marcus that assault on a Queen's Guard was a serious criminal offense that could result in significant fines and even imprisonment. She outlined the process that would follow, including a formal interview at the police station and the possibility of charges being filed. The bureaucratic machinery of the justice system was now in motion, and Marcus was beginning to understand that his moment of anger might have consequences far beyond anything he had anticipated. As the immediate situation was being resolved, something unexpected happened. William Hayes, who had remained perfectly still throughout the entire confrontation and investigation, made a subtle gesture that only Marcus noticed. Without breaking his ceremonial stance or moving his head, the young guard made brief eye contact with Marcus and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The gesture lasted only a fraction of a second, but its impact on Marcus was profound. In that brief moment of human connection, he saw not judgment or anger, but something that looked almost like understanding. The soldier, who had every right to be furious about being assaulted instead, seemed to be acknowledging that Marcus was a fellow human being who had made a mistake. This small act of grace from someone he had wronged hit Marcus harder than any punishment the legal system might impose. For the first time in years, he found himself genuinely questioning his own behavior and the anger that had been driving so many of his actions. The discipline and dignity that William had maintained throughout the entire incident stood in stark contrast to Marcus's own lack of self-control. Detective Inspector Collins continued her investigation, taking statements from witnesses and gathering the phone videos that would serve as evidence. The process was thorough, but routine for her. Just another incident in a career spent dealing with the occasional conflicts that arose when millions of tourists interacted with one of the world's most famous landmarks. But for Marcus, nothing about this felt routine. As he watched the professional way the security team handled the situation, and as he continued to observe William's unwavering commitment to his duty despite what had just happened, Marcus began to understand that he had encountered something he had rarely seen in his own life: true discipline and genuine strength. The young soldier, who had seemed so privileged and arrogant from a distance, revealed himself to be someone with a level of self-control and dedication that Marcus had never developed. The ability to maintain composure under pressure, to do one's duty regardless of personal comfort or convenience, and to respond to aggression with dignity rather than retaliation were qualities that Marcus realized he desperately lacked. As the police interview continued, Marcus found himself thinking about his business, his failed relationships, and the pattern of anger and frustration that seemed to define too much of his life. He had always blamed external circumstances for his problems, but witnessing William's response to genuine provocation made him wonder whether the real issue might be his own inability to control his reactions to stress and disappointment. The legal consequences of his actions were still to be determined, but Marcus was beginning to understand that the real reckoning would be internal. The brief moment of connection with the guard he had assaulted had opened a door to self-reflection that he hadn't even known existed. As Detective Inspector Collins concluded her preliminary investigation and prepared to escort Marcus to the police station for a formal interview, William Hayes continued to stand at his post, fulfilling his duty just as he had before the confrontation began. His commitment to his responsibilities, regardless of personal circumstances, would stay with Marcus long after the legal proceedings were finished. The viral video that was already spreading across social media would show the world what happened when someone tried to intimidate a Queen's Guard. But the deeper story of how that encounter began to change both men involved would take much longer to unfold. The police station in central London was bustling with its usual mixture of tourists reporting pickpocket incidents, local residents filing complaints, and the steady stream of minor criminal cases that kept the Metropolitan Police busy every day. Marcus Thompson found himself sitting in an interview room that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, staring at a gray metal table while Detective Inspector Sarah Collins reviewed the preliminary evidence from the incident at Buckingham Palace. The gravity of his situation was becoming clearer with each passing hour. What had started as a moment of road rage and frustration had evolved into a formal criminal investigation that could result in serious charges. Marcus had been advised of his right to legal representation, and a duty solicitor was on the way to help him navigate the complex legal process that lay ahead. While he waited, Marcus found his thoughts constantly returning to the moment when William Hayes had made that brief eye contact and subtle nod. The gesture had lasted only seconds, but it continued to resonate in ways that Marcus couldn't fully understand. He had expected anger, contempt, or at least satisfaction from someone he had wronged so publicly. Instead, he had encountered something that looked remarkably like forgiveness or at least recognition of their shared humanity. Detective Inspector Collins returned to the interview room with a thick folder containing witness statements, photographic evidence, and transcripts of the videos that had already been uploaded to various social media platforms. The viral nature of the incident meant that the case had attracted attention from senior officers and potentially even government officials who were concerned about the security implications of attacks on royal guards. The detective explained to Marcus that the investigation would be thorough and that the Crown Prosecution Service would ultimately decide whether to pursue criminal charges. The potential offenses included assault, disturbing the peace, and interference with a royal ceremonial duty. Each charge carried significant penalties, including possible imprisonment, substantial fines, and a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. As the formal interview began, Marcus struggled to explain his actions in a way that made any sense. The frustrations that had driven him to confront William now seemed pathetically insignificant when described to a police officer. Traffic delays, business problems, and personal relationship issues were challenges that millions of people dealt with every day without resorting to physical aggression against complete strangers. Detective Inspector Collins was professional but thorough in her questioning. She had investigated hundreds of similar incidents over her career, and she recognized the pattern of someone whose poor impulse control had led them into serious legal trouble. Her job was to establish the facts of the case, not to provide counseling or life advice. But she couldn't help noticing that Marcus seemed genuinely remorseful about his actions. While Marcus was being interviewed, William Hayes had completed his ceremonial duty and was now providing his own statement to investigators. His account was precise and factual, describing exactly what had occurred without editorializing or expressing personal opinions about Marcus's motivations. The discipline that had kept him motionless during the assault now served him well as he provided clear, objective testimony about the incident. William's statement revealed something that Marcus would later learn. Throughout the entire confrontation, the young guard had been primarily concerned about the safety of the tourists and bystanders rather than his own welfare. His training had taught him to assess threats not just to himself, but to the civilians around him, and he had been prepared to break protocol and intervene if he had believed that Marcus posed a danger to others. As the interview continued, Detective Inspector Collins showed Marcus some of the social media videos that had already been posted online. Watching himself on camera was a profoundly uncomfortable experience for Marcus. The angry, aggressive man in the videos seemed like a stranger, someone whose behavior was completely at odds with how Marcus liked to think of himself. The videos clearly showed that Marcus had been the aggressor throughout the incident, while William had maintained his composure and professionalism despite obvious provocation. The contrast between their behavior was stark and undeniable, leaving no room for Marcus to rationalize his actions or shift blame to external circumstances. One particular video, shot by a tourist from Germany, had already been viewed over 2 million times and generated thousands of comments from people around the world. The comment section was filled with criticism of Marcus's behavior and praise for the guard's discipline and restraint. Many commenters shared their own experiences with the Queen's Guards, describing them as dedicated professionals who deserved respect rather than harassment. Reading these comments was another humbling experience for Marcus. Complete strangers from different countries and cultures all seemed to understand something that he had missed. That William Hayes was not an arrogant representative of privilege, but a young man doing an important job with dignity and dedication. The uniform that Marcus had seen as a symbol of unearned authority was actually earned through hard work, training, and commitment to something larger than personal interests. The duty solicitor arrived and spent an hour reviewing the case with Marcus, explaining the legal process and the various options available to him. The lawyer was experienced in handling assault cases and quickly recognized that the evidence against Marcus was overwhelming. The videos, witness statements, and victim testimony all clearly established that an assault had occurred, leaving little room for legal maneuvering. However, the solicitor also noted several factors that might work in Marcus's favor during sentencing if charges were filed. He had no previous criminal record. He appeared genuinely remorseful about his actions, and the assault, while serious, had not resulted in physical injury to the victim. These mitigating circumstances might lead to a more lenient sentence, though they wouldn't change the fact that a crime had been committed. As the formal processes continued, Marcus found himself thinking about his life in ways he never had before. The anger and frustration that had driven his actions at Buckingham Palace weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of behavior that had been affecting his relationships, his business, and his overall quality of life for years. His girlfriend Sarah had left him because she was tired of his unpredictable temper and his tendency to blame others for his problems. His business had struggled not just because of economic factors, but because his aggressive personality had driven away potential customers who found him difficult to work with. Even his relationships with family members had become strained as they grew tired of his constant complaints and negative attitude. The discipline and self-control that William Hayes had displayed during their confrontation represented qualities that Marcus realized he desperately needed to develop. The ability to remain calm under pressure, to fulfill responsibilities regardless of personal comfort, and to treat others with respect even when they didn't deserve it were skills that could transform not just Marcus's legal situation, but his entire approach to life. Detective Inspector Collins concluded the interview and explained that Marcus would be released on bail while the Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the case and decided whether to file formal charges. The decision could take several weeks, during which time Marcus would have to live with the uncertainty of not knowing whether he would face trial and potential imprisonment. As Marcus prepared to leave the police station, he asked Detective Inspector Collins if it would be possible for him to speak with William Hayes. He wasn't sure exactly what he wanted to say, but he felt a strong need to apologize directly to the young man he had wronged. The detective explained that such contact would not be appropriate during an ongoing investigation, but she noted that Marcus's desire to make amends might be taken into consideration by the prosecution. Walking out of the police station into the London afternoon, Marcus felt like a different person than the one who had started the day in such anger and frustration. The legal consequences of his actions were still uncertain, but the personal reckoning had already begun. He had encountered someone whose strength was based not on intimidation or aggression, but on discipline, duty, and genuine character. The viral videos would continue to spread across social media, generating millions of views and making Marcus an unwitting symbol of everything wrong with modern attitudes toward authority and respect. But for Marcus himself, the real story was just beginning. The moment when he had tried to intimidate a Queen's Guard had instead introduced him to qualities he never knew he was missing. The long process of rebuilding his life, his relationships, and his understanding of what it meant to be a strong man was about to begin. And somewhere across London, William Hayes continued with his duties, probably never fully understanding how profoundly his example of quiet dignity had affected the life of someone who had tried to humiliate him. 6 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Marcus Thompson stood outside the Army Careers Information Office in Camden, holding a worn piece of paper with William Hayes's full name and military unit written in careful handwriting. The Crown Prosecution Service had ultimately decided not to pursue criminal charges, influenced by Marcus's lack of prior convictions, his evident remorse, and a victim impact statement from William that recommended leniency. The viral video of their confrontation had eventually faded from social media prominence, replaced by newer controversies and entertainment. But for Marcus, the impact of that brief encounter had continued to reverberate through every aspect of his life. The discipline and dignity that William had displayed in the face of unprovoked aggression had become a standard against which Marcus measured his own behavior, and found it consistently lacking. The transformation had not been immediate or easy. In the weeks following the incident, Marcus had struggled with depression and self-doubt as he confronted the reality of how his anger and lack of self-control had affected not just that single moment, but years of relationships and opportunities. His motorcycle repair business had suffered further damage when the viral video made him recognizable to potential customers, many of whom associated him with aggression and poor judgment. Sarah, his ex-girlfriend, had agreed to meet with him once to discuss their relationship, but she had made it clear that his public humiliation didn't change the fundamental personality issues that had driven them apart. She wished him well in addressing his problems, but had no interest in resuming their romantic relationship. This conversation, painful as it was, had helped Marcus understand that changing his public image was less important than changing the underlying behaviors that had caused his problems in the first place. The breakthrough had come when Marcus decided to seek professional help for his anger management issues. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was a therapist who specialized in helping people develop better emotional regulation and communication skills. Through their weekly sessions, Marcus began to understand that his aggressive behavior was often a defense mechanism designed to mask feelings of inadequacy and fear of vulnerability. Dr. Martinez had helped Marcus trace his anger patterns back to childhood experiences with his own father, a man who had dealt with frustration through intimidation and verbal aggression. Marcus had unconsciously adopted these same strategies, believing that strength meant never backing down and never admitting weakness. The example of William Hayes had shown him an entirely different model of masculinity, one based on self-discipline rather than domination of others. As part of his therapy, Marcus had begun volunteering at a youth center in his neighborhood, working with teenagers who were struggling with similar issues around anger and violence. Teaching young people about conflict resolution and emotional regulation had forced him to articulate and practice the principles he was trying to learn himself. The irony was not lost on him that he was now encouraging others to develop exactly the kind of self-control he had failed to demonstrate at Buckingham Palace. The volunteering had also introduced Marcus to James Wilson, a former Army sergeant who now ran community programs for at-risk youth. James had served in the same regiment as William Hayes and had known him during their time in Afghanistan. Through James, Marcus had learned more about William's background and military service, discovering that the young man he had tried to intimidate was actually a decorated veteran who had served with distinction in combat situations. This revelation had only deepened Marcus's respect for William and his regret about their confrontation. The soldier he had assumed was privileged and sheltered had actually risked his life in defense of others and had chosen to continue serving his country in a ceremonial role that required its own form of courage. Standing motionless while tourists and occasional aggressors tested your composure required a different kind of bravery than combat, but it was bravery nonetheless. James Wilson had eventually agreed to help Marcus make contact with William, though he warned that the young guard might not be interested in meeting with someone who had assaulted him. The military took such incidents seriously, and William's career could have been affected if his superiors had decided that he had somehow provoked the confrontation. Fortunately, the clear video evidence had demonstrated that William had behaved with complete professionalism throughout the incident. The meeting was arranged for a Saturday afternoon at a quiet pub in South London, far from the tourist areas where William might be recognized. Marcus arrived early, nervous about facing someone he had wronged so publicly and uncertain about what he hoped to accomplish through the encounter. He had practiced various apologies and explanations, but none of them seemed adequate to address the complexity of what had occurred between them. William Hayes entered the pub wearing civilian clothes, looking even younger than he had in his ceremonial uniform. He was accompanied by James Wilson, who had agreed to facilitate the meeting and ensure that it remained constructive. The three men found a corner table where they could speak privately, away from the normal Saturday afternoon crowd of football fans and families. Marcus began with a straightforward apology, acknowledging that his behavior had been completely inappropriate and that William had done nothing to deserve being assaulted while simply doing his job. He explained that he had been going through personal and professional difficulties, but emphasized that these circumstances did not excuse his actions or justify taking his frustrations out on an innocent person. William listened politely, but remained somewhat reserved, unsure about Marcus's motivation for seeking this meeting and uncertain whether it was appropriate for him to be having this conversation at all. His military training had taught him to be cautious about personal relationships that might compromise his professional duties or create potential security concerns. As the conversation continued, Marcus began to share what he had learned about himself in the months since their encounter. He described his anger management therapy, his volunteer work with troubled youth, and his growing understanding of how his behavior had affected his relationships and opportunities. Most importantly, he tried to explain how William's example of discipline and dignity under pressure had inspired him to seek help and make fundamental changes in his approach to life. This personal testimony seemed to resonate with William in ways that a simple apology might not have. As someone who had chosen military service partly as a way to develop self-discipline and direction in his own life, William understood the appeal of structure and accountability for someone struggling with behavioral issues. He began to share some of his own experiences with anger and frustration, particularly during his difficult childhood in Liverpool and his early military training. The conversation gradually became less formal as both men recognized their shared experiences with adversity and personal growth. William described the mental challenges of ceremonial duty, particularly the need to maintain composure while dealing with everything from genuine threats to obnoxious tourists trying to get a reaction. Marcus talked about the ongoing work he was doing to develop better emotional regulation and communication skills. James Wilson, who had initially been prepared to cut the meeting short if it became uncomfortable for either participant, found himself impressed by the genuine connection that was developing between the two men. Both had been shaped by difficult circumstances and were working to become better versions of themselves, though they had chosen very different paths toward that goal. As the afternoon progressed, William revealed that the incident at Buckingham Palace had affected him more than he had initially admitted. While his training had prepared him to deal with physical confrontation, the viral nature of the video and the public attention it had generated had created stress and scrutiny that was difficult to manage. He had been required to provide multiple statements to investigators and had faced questions about whether he had somehow provoked the assault. Marcus was horrified to learn that his actions had created ongoing problems for William beyond the immediate physical confrontation. He offered to provide written statements or public testimony that would make it clear that William had behaved with complete professionalism and had in no way contributed to the incident. This offer, more than anything else, seemed to convince William that Marcus's remorse was genuine and that his desire to make amends was sincere. The meeting concluded with both men agreeing to stay in touch, though they understood that their relationship would necessarily be limited by William's ongoing military service and public role. Marcus provided William with updates on his community volunteer work and his continued progress in anger management therapy. William occasionally shared insights about discipline and goal setting that he had learned through military training. A year after their first confrontation, Marcus had transformed his motorcycle repair business into a successful operation that specialized in working with young mechanics and providing job training for people trying to rebuild their lives after incarceration or addiction. The discipline and respect for others that he had learned from his encounter with William had become fundamental principles in how he ran his business and treated his employees. William Hayes continued his service as a Queen's Guard, eventually becoming one of the senior non-commissioned officers responsible for training new guards in the protocols and mental preparation required for ceremonial duties. He occasionally used the story of his encounter with Marcus as an example of how maintaining composure and dignity under pressure could have positive effect that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The viral video of their original confrontation occasionally resurfaced on social media, usually in compilations of instant karma or videos showing people learning hard lessons. But neither Marcus nor William paid much attention to these reminders of their worst and best moments respectively. They had both moved forward with their lives, carrying with them the understanding that even the most negative encounters could become opportunities for growth and positive change. The lesson that emerged from their story was not about instant karma or the satisfaction of seeing someone get their comeuppance. Instead, it was about the power of responding to aggression with dignity, the possibility of redemption even after public failure, and the unexpected ways that brief encounters between strangers can change lives forever. Marcus Thompson had learned that true strength came not from intimidating others, but from controlling himself. William Hayes had discovered that his commitment to duty and discipline could inspire others to become better people. Both men had found that their moment of conflict, captured on countless smartphones and shared around the world, had ultimately become the foundation for positive transformation that neither could have imagined when it first occurred. Their story became a quiet reminder that even in an age of viral videos and instant judgment, people are capable of learning, growing, and becoming better versions of themselves when they encounter the right example at the right moment in their lives.